get a little button that says, do you agree to recording? And so we appreciate you saying yes. And then that way I've told Maria Jose in 5, 10, 20 years, or maybe next month, she'll look back at it and I'll be really excited.
Yes, exactly. Oh my gosh, thank you.
Okay, I think we're recording. Are you ready, Maria Jose? Should we get started?
Yes, I'm ready. Let's go ahead and start.
All right. Okay, I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming everyone, friends, family, colleagues, to the thesis presentation of Maria Jose Pastor Infantas. And I will say my name is Kimberly Tanner. I am a professor of biology, an unintended professor of biology at San Francisco State University. I'm first generation college going. I am a neuroscientist by training, and I would not have predicted I would have ever been a professor. So it's I'll share that about myself. You are in for a huge treat. Maria Jose has done a fabulous project, even in these times of ongoing racial injustice and violence and all the stress of and unfairness of that and a global pandemic. And I've got to say, I'm not surprised at how well that Maria Jose has done. I have known Maria Jose for over a decade. I don't get to say that about everyone that I work with. And I'm going to keep this somewhat brief, but I have to really share that I am extraordinarily proud of Maria Jose and all that she's accomplished. And if you hear my voice shake, I'm okay, but it just means that I care a lot about. Oh, thank you. So I want to just share a few things about Maria Jose, and they are characteristics that are going to take her so far in her career and her personal life. She is incredibly curious. So Maria Jose is first and foremost a scientist. I shout out, I really wish I was there talking with your family, because I predict when you were a little kid, it was really clear how curious you were and how you were always investigating things around you. From the moment I met you, it was really clear to me that you are just an incredibly scientific thinker, very curious. I saw that from when you were in introductory biology with me so many years ago, and I think it was 2011. I also want to say that I am incredibly impressed that Maria Jose and everything I've ever seen her do is phenomenally collaborative. She is the graduate teaching assistant who can rally a whole group of people to think about things in a different way. I've seen her collaborate with K through 12 teachers and make a huge difference in the kind of science education that little kids are going to get. And in our laboratory, she's been just a fabulous connector between lots of different people with lots of different goals. And then the last thing I'll say is Maria Jose and I share, we share a lot of loves. We share a love of music, and we find ourselves at the same concerts, like dancing around like maniacs. We share a love of lots of things that are outside the realm of science. But I think one of the core things that we both love is K through 12 education and K through 12 teachers. I will say I have learned pretty much everything important to know about teaching and learning from elementary and middle school teachers. Shout out. And their voices are often not centered and their expertise is often not valued. And when Maria Jose came back to the lab and wanted to do thesis research with me, we tried to find a project that she cared very deeply about and we thought would be an incredibly meaningful contribution. And I say she has delivered that amazingly well. So I'm going to stop there and say you're in for a treat. So excited and so proud of everything she's accomplished in such hard times. Please unmute and give some snaps or some claps for the fabulous Maria Jose, who will now present.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Kimberly, for that introduction. I have not cried, so we're okay. So we can keep going. All right. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for all of you for coming. My name is Maria Jose Pastor, and I did my thesis on investigating teacher attitudes about science teaching in San Francisco public elementary schools. Okay? All right, so I just want to take a moment and talk about these expectations for the presentation. So there is going to be so much opportunity for you to be engaged and active in the chat. So please mute yourself throughout the entire presentation. And if you have a question, you can go ahead and save it until the end because we are going to have like a Q&A portion, okay? However, if there is like a question, you're just like, I don't know absolutely what anything is going on right now, you're absolutely welcome to type it into the chat. Yeah? Cool? All right. Okay, so before we started talking about my thesis, I am going to ask you to think to yourself for just a moment. What is one thing you remember from a science class in elementary school? And if you don't remember anything, that's okay. All good. I barely remember what I eat for breakfast in the morning, so no worries. You can go ahead and think about that as well. And just think to yourself. And then once you got some ideas, go ahead and type them into the chat, but hold back on pressing enter. Don't press enter just yet until I ask you to. So just type it, but don't press that return key. And then press enter. Photosynthesis. Reading giant words. Marine biology was my favorite. Being intimidated until a teacher took me under her wing. Then we started dissecting, and I was so excited. Amazing. Going to the exploratorium. Awesome, Lucia. But of a science camp in Walden West, I was not able to go, and I was so disappointed. Oh my gosh. I've been in that situation too, Musette, so I empathize. All right. So it looks like there were a lot of different answers. And I myself actually haven't had a lot of experience in science in elementary school, which is one of the reasons of why I even wanted to pursue this project. But before we kind of go into depth about my master's, I want to tell you a little bit about me and myself and how I got here. Okay? All right, so that's me. That's me catching insects or bees in front of Hensel Hall at 10 p.m. at night at San Francisco State. Now, if you don't know where Hensel Hall is, that is the building where the Department of Biology resides at San Francisco State. And I am an alumni from SF State. I received my bachelor's in science in zoology in 2015. And I am very passionate about all branches of biology. So about botany, herpetology, you name it, I probably love it. But I am particularly passionate about entomology, or the study of insects and other invertebrates. Now, this passion led me to be part of the zombie lab that's actually also in Hensel Hall, and that's on the second floor. And there I actually got to help others with their insects projects. And I also had the opportunity to actually present and conduct my own research. And that was all during my undergrad at SF State. But besides being passionate about insects, I have always been passionate about helping people of color. So I was recommended by Kimberly Tanner to join BUMP, which was a pilot mentoring program to help biology undergrad students, and particularly students of color, in their first years at SF State. And I had the pleasure of actually being one of those mentors in that program. And as a woman of color who migrated with her family from Peru, that was really important to me to be part of something like that. And I felt really honored to be part of that program. But after that, I continued to want to be a mentor or somehow to work with students. And Kimberly Tanner also recommended me to be a facilitator for the SCI program that was offered by the CSME. And these courses were like support classes that students took with concurrently with their major courses to get extra help. So this is where students, got to ask questions, meet people, make friends. And I got to be a facilitator for one of those programs, or for one of those classes. And that was my first time actually being a teacher in front of a class. And I loved it so much, which was very surprising for someone who spent years working with insects in a lab. I didn't know I could work with people so well. Now, after that, I graduated, and I had the opportunity, to actually work in a lot of different after-school programs. And in each of those programs, I noticed how particularly elementary school teachers, because that's who I mainly worked with, they created more, than just a classroom for their students. They created a community, and they helped their students, feel safe, ask questions, and just really be part of a class. But in each of these programs, I also noticed that these teachers were really afraid of teaching science. And as someone who loves science, I was just really surprised. I really wanted to know why. So I emailed Kimberly after like 5 years of not speaking, and she suggested to me to apply for my master's at SF State and to join CEPL, where I could further investigate this question. Yeah, and that's how I got here. So that's why we're here today. All right, so now that you know a little bit more about me and how this project got started, let's get back to thinking about elementary science education. So go ahead and think to yourself for a moment, why do you think elementary science education is important? And if you don't know, that's okay. I'm not expecting you to know all the answers. I just want to know what you think. Okay? And then once you got some ideas, go ahead and type them into the chat, but don't press enter until I ask you to, just like we did before. And press enter. Okay, yeah, it connects to the real world, foundational knowledge, learns how the world is connected, helps young kids get interested in science. Exactly, little kids, naturally curious. Exactly, very good. Important. Oh, yes, very good. So science education is really important, right? And you guys are kind of all on the same train. And the main reason why it's important, as many of you said, it provides this opportunity for youth to learn and engage with their natural world at a really young age, right? And now previous literature also shares that learning science at an early age actually helps build these skill building experiences that are very integral for child development and for later scientific literacy. So it's really important, right? That's pretty much what we can take away from this. But now that we know why it's important, let's focus on what else has been researched about science education. So a lot of research has focused on material availability. And in the 80s, they noticed that hands-on learning with materials can improve student learning and achievement in science. Now, other research has focused on standardized assessment. And that's like those, yearly exams that we would take in grade school or even in middle school that we would have so that people can assess how students of certain ages are doing in a subject. And a lot of the time they would do it on like math, science, or reading. But there isn't so much focused on elementary education standardized testing, but a lot on how middle and high school teachers interpret this. And this paper that was done in 2012 states that middle and high school teachers don't believe that assessing a student yearly is an efficient way to measure how much science is done in the classroom, which I think a lot of us can agree on that as well, right? Now, finally, there's also been a lot of research on how much science is actually taught in the classroom, and particularly in elementary school classrooms. And a study done by the Lawrence Hall of Science in 2007 found that 80% of elementary school teachers in the Bay Area mentioned that they spend 60 minutes or less on science instruction per week. Now, not many studies, though, focus on the person who has the most influence in the classroom, right? The teachers. So specifically, not much research has focused on what attitudes do elementary school teachers have about science teaching. And additionally, there have been very few studies that focus on school type and how it could affect these attitudes too. Now, I want to be clear that when I say attitudes, I mean whether or not they have a positive or a negative attitude towards science. Okay? All right, so this leads me to my research, which is trying to understand the attitudes that elementary school teachers, particularly in San Francisco Unified School District, or otherwise known as SFUSD, have about science teaching. Now, I'm particularly interested in comparing and understanding the differences between Title I and non-Title I school teachers. Now, to unpack that a little, Title I schools are schools that have a higher percentage of low-income students, and particularly greater than or equal to 40%. And because they have such a high percentage of low-income students, they receive federal funds to help support students in academic fields. So usually these funds are like contributed to like mathematics tutors or reading tutors and stuff like that. Now, according to a previous literature, we also notice that Title I schools tend to have more students of color, and they also tend to retain more teachers of color. And they also tend to have less access to additional resources, okay? Now, non-Title I schools are schools that have less than 40% of their student population that comes from low-income families, okay? Now, I want to stop here, though. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that while traditionally we may see more students of color and low-income and teachers of color at Title I schools, it does not mean that they do not exist at non-Title I, okay? And it also does not mean that non-Title I schools are not struggling in certain areas, because schools are constantly struggling regardless, right? These non-Title I schools just tend to have more students that come from economically advantaged backgrounds, okay? So I just want to make that clear before we move on, right? All right, so the main reason I wanted to compare these types of schools, though, is because I wanted to understand if teachers who work at schools with less access to resources and more students of low income have different attitudes towards science teaching versus teachers who just tend to have more access to resources and less students of low income. Okay? Yeah? All right. So in order for us to understand this question, we wanted to understand what influences these attitudes first. And we wanted to break this down in 3 different areas. So first, we wanted to know school influences, classroom influences, and personal influences, okay? Now, for school influences, we were particularly interested in understanding additional resources like PTA funding, okay? Now, second, we wanted to understand classroom influences, so like the barriers or the supports that either keep teachers from teaching more science weekly or encourage them to teach more, okay? Now, finally, we wanted to understand personal influences, so how gender, identity, and or ethnicity have an effect on their attitudes towards science teaching, okay? Now, overall, and most importantly, we wanted to know how these attitudes differ between Title I and non-Title I school teachers. All right, so what were our methods? How did we do all of this? Well, we did this actually in 3 different steps. And first, we found our participants, and they were 130 SFUSD science teacher leaders. Now, to be clear, science teacher leaders are regular elementary school teachers. The only reason why they're called science teacher leaders is because they are the advocates for the current curriculum being used. Okay, so they attend professional development trainings about this curriculum, and usually they'll bring the information that they learned and teach to their colleagues, right? So essentially, these teacher leaders probably think about science a little bit more than other elementary school teachers. And this is why we actually chose them to be our participants, because we wanted to make sure that whoever was taking our assessment already had, like science on the brain, right? Now, another important thing I want to mention about science teacher leaders is that most of the time, these leaders are chosen by their principal, and it is not a requirement for them to have a science degree to be a science teacher leader. Okay? Now, after we found our participants, we decided to get working on our assessment, or also commonly known as a survey, right? Now, our survey or our assessment was 8 questions, and it had 2 different types of prompts. It had open-ended prompts, and it had challenge statements, or close-ended prompts. Now, open-ended prompts are just questions that ask participants to just write a written response. And challenge statements, on the other hand, are statements that ask participants to make an assertion Okay, so to ask them to answer whether they agree or disagree with that statement. Okay. Now, in our assessment, we also asked teachers to write why they agreed or why they disagreed to that to that statement, because we wanted to understand their rationale. Now, I'm going to go over the order of our assessment. So the way we ordered our assessment was by most broad questions at the end to more specific questions, more broad questions at the beginning and more specific questions at the end. Okay, so these are the first 3 questions of our assessment tool. I teach science every week, and the list 3 supports and the list 3 barriers questions, or the classroom influences. Now, I teach science every week is a challenge statement because it is a statement that participants would either agree or disagree to, and then they would write why they agreed or disagreed to it. Okay? Now, the list 3 barriers and supports are examples of open-ended questions because we ask teachers to simply, write, 3 supports or barriers that either encourage them or keep them from teaching more science weekly. Okay? Now, the reason why we started with the I teach science every week as that first question is because we wanted to make sure that the teachers we were speaking to were regularly engaged, in science teaching. Now, we asked these 3 questions, though, first overall, because they're broad and because they give teachers an opportunity to think about their own experiences and their own classroom influences on science teaching. Now, as we moved forward in our assessment, like I mentioned, we probed for more specific influences. For example, as you can see here, we asked teachers how certain things like material availability, grade level assessments, and even how their college science course experiences affect their attitudes towards science teaching. So we carefully ordered our questions from broad to specific so that we did not get any biased responses. Okay? Now, we also asked at the end of the assessment a section for a demographic form. And in that form, we asked teachers about their background, so their identity, their gender identity and their ethnicity. And then we also asked about their teaching experience, so what grades they have taught and what grades they're currently teaching. And then finally, we asked what type of school they teach at, so if they taught at a Title I or a non-Title I school. Now, after we were done doing all that, we worked on our recruitment strategy. So how we were going to get all these teachers, to participate in this assessment. And we did that through email. And the email was sent by the SFUSD Elementary Science Coordinator. And then we also created raffle prizes, to incentivize teachers to participate. Now, something important to note is that all the responses in our assessment were completely anonymous. So no identifiable information about the teacher or the school was collected. Okay? All right, so now the way that we analyzed our data. So because we had 2 different types of prompts, we had to analyze it in 2 different types of ways. So first we did quantitative analysis, or we analyzed the closed-ended portions of those challenge statements. And that was coded and quantified by calculating the percentage or the amount of teachers that responded agree, disagree, or don't know. Okay? Now, second, we did qualitative analysis, or we analyzed those written responses or those open-ended questions. And that was a little bit more involved and a little bit more difficult because to do this, we had to code those written responses and find common themes in those responses. And then we coded to consensus to officially create different categories, okay? Now, some of you are probably like, what the heck, does that all mean? What do you mean find common themes and then make categories, right? Well, really, a more simple way of kind of saying how we started this is that we started reading and noticing things that stood out to us in those written responses, okay? So we're going to go through this together and do a little mini activity, okay? So go ahead and take a moment to read these responses to yourself. Both of these here. And then once you're done, go ahead and think to yourself, what are some things that these teachers mention that stand out to you? And then once you got some ideas about that, actually, why don't we give me a thumbs up if you're done reading before I move on to the next slide. Give me a thumbs up. Give me some clear thumbs. Yeah. All right. So lots of thumbs. Lots of animated thumbs. Very nice. All right. So go ahead and type in those things that you noticed into the chat, but don't press enter until I ask you to, just like we've been doing before. Lots of heads down. I notice people typing. And then go ahead and press enter. Oh my goodness. Floods of responses. All right, having time to trim parts due to time constraints and prioritizing math and ELA. Hector's got it. Time, prioritization of other subjects. Science standards are not prioritized in elementary school. Very good. Lack of time and ability to prioritize. Time limited because prioritization of other subjects. Oh my gosh, time. Yes, amazing. All right, so you guys did it. Now you guys just actually did a small piece of some qualitative education research. So congrats. So just like each of you did, after finding these common themes, we created categories based on those themes that seemed to be like the most prevalent or that came up the most often. And in these, it was obviously time, right? We see that there's just not enough time. Now, after you find those common themes and create these kind of categories, you would usually code your responses with another scientist to make sure that each of you think that these responses would actually fit into those categories that you created or those common themes that you found, right? And I'm going to show you those categories that were created in just a minute when we actually go through the responses, right? All right. So now we're going to shift on over to the results. So who ended up being our participants in it all? So out of those 130 teachers we sent it to, only 64 responded. And out of those 64, there were only 38 participants that met our inclusion and our selection criteria, which was that they simply provided, the type of school that they taught at. But we also ended up eliminating participants that only responded to at least half of the assessment, which is a small reason why our sample size ended up being so small. Now, additionally, our sample size also ended up being small because all of this data was collected during COVID-19. And unlike doing research with insects or any other invertebrates, you can't make people participate into your assessment, right? People have opinions and they will decide whether or not they want to do it. Now, I also want to mention that since our sample ended up being so small, we are going to show all statistical trends that are in our research, including ones that are not significant, okay? And there's a lot of interesting trends that we noticed even in this small sample size. Now, if we kind of orient yourself here to this graph that's on this slide, we look at the amount of Title I teachers in comparison to non-Title I teachers. It's actually pretty well split, right? Now, in our sample size, we also had quite a few women participants and people of color. Now, something interesting to point out is that there were quite a few more people of color in our Title I schools versus our non-Title I. And while this wasn't statistically significant, it actually would represent a trend if our sample size was just a bit larger, right? Now, I also want to mention that we did collect data, right, from their grade level teaching experience, but because none of our results that I'm going to be sharing with you today have to do with grade level teaching, I decided to not include it in here. Okay? All right. So what did we find? Now, the way that we're going to go through our results is by going through each of these research questions, okay? So we're going to start off with school influences, or how does parent-teacher association funding influence science teaching? So let's talk about PTA funding for a minute though. PTA, which stands for Parent Teacher Association, is extra funding, and that comes from parents of the school. And the way that these funds are spent depends on the school, and it depends on the PTA, right? Or like the parent who decided to fund this, parents. But the bottom line to understand is that this funding is additional, and it does not come from the district, so not all schools receive this extra funding, okay? Now, something else I want to mention before we get on into understanding the results is that, remember, we compared the responses between Title I and non-Title I teachers for each of these questions. And I'm actually going to be showing you those comparisons today. Okay? All right, so now I'm going to have you take a poll here. And this poll asks you, do you think Title I and non-Title I teachers responded the same or different to the challenge statement below? Or maybe you're not sure, and that's okay too, so you can always answer that as well. Now, the challenge statement is PTA fundraising is essential to support science teaching at our school. Okay, now I'm gonna launch the poll. Relaunch. Continue. And there you go. I'll give you a few minutes to go ahead and answer that. And remember, Title I schools here, I'm going to make that clear for everyone, are schools that have greater than or 40% of their students that come from low income, whereas non-Title I is the opposite, okay? So we have a few more people here. I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay, all right, we're at 22. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll here. Great. All right, I'm gonna end it. Ooh, okay. Let me share those results with you here. So 17% of you, so 4 individuals here, think it's gonna be the same. And then 83% think it's going to be different. So that's very interesting. That's 19 of you here already. Okay? All right. So I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to close that poll. All right. So before I actually show you the responses, I want to orient you to what you're about to see in this graph. Okay? So the bar on the far left here is the distribution of responses for all teachers. And I circled that down there. Now, the one in the middle is how Title I teachers responded to this challenge statement, and the one on the far right is how non-Title I teachers responded. Okay? Now, let's check it out. Woo! Okay, so now blue bars represent agree, and white bars represent disagree, and gray bars represent don't know. So knowing what these bars represent, what these colors represent, we can clearly see that a large amount of Title I teachers disagreed with the challenge statement, PTA is essential to support science teaching at our school. So, now that we know how they responded to the close-ended portion of this question, let's take a look at what they said in their written responses, shall we? All right, so here are some direct quotes from those written responses of teachers, and I'll go ahead and read them aloud to you. I believe that PTA funds the science coordinator position. This is the person who keeps the supply stocked, organized, and managed. She assists teachers in setup, cleanup, and teaching if needed, and it makes it so much easier to teach science with this kind of support, especially to encourage and excite new teachers to teach. And that was mentioned by Gertrude, a non-Title I teacher. Now, I just want to point out, although you see these names, these are pseudonyms. So they're not the real names, remember, because all our collection of people was anonymous. So these are pseudonyms that we gave teachers. Okay, just want to point that out. Now, Sydney, a Title I teacher, says, I think teaching science is possible without PTA funding. I know it is, because that's my current situation, but it can't hurt. This speaks to a bigger issue of systemic inequality in education, though. For schools that have a strong PTA, they are generally given more opportunities. It would be absolutely fantastic if we could have a PTA-funded science teacher, STEAM teacher, technology teacher, etc. So pretty powerful responses here. Now, as I mentioned, once we look, at these written responses, we try to find common themes in these responses, and then we make categories based off those themes. And as I mentioned, we always try to compare the responses between Title I and non-Title I teachers. Okay? So let's take a look at those common themes and categories that we created. All right, so these are the first three most prevalent categories, so the most common ones that were mentioned. And the first one is PTA provides extra funds for extracurriculars and materials. Second, PTA funds are not essential to support science teaching at my school. And third, PTA funds science positions and professional development opportunities. So let's see the distribution between Title I and non-Title I teachers. So there's a lot of variation here, right? Now, as you can see, more Title I teachers mention that PTA provides extra funds for extracurriculars, which are like field trips and materials. And this was statistically significant. Now, we also see that as we go down, only non-Title I teachers mentioned that their PTA funds actually pay for science positions, or pay for like extra science teachers or professional development opportunities. Now, there were other common themes that we noticed, but these common themes were only mentioned by Title I teachers. Now, Title I teachers were the only ones to mention that they did not have a PTA and that PTA funding is inequitable. So, what can we interpret, from these results? Well, we can claim that Title I teachers in our sample are just more aware of the inequities that PTA funding can cause. Now, the reason that this may be is because teachers at Title I schools are viewing science teaching from a different perspective. Since they don't have the PTA funds to teach science, they have an ability to probably understand the inequities that it can cause. And that's actually something that's been mentioned in previous research of PTA funding and so on, right? Now, we can also claim that PTA funds clearly appear to drive teaching inequities or science teaching inequities. And this is because since non-Title I teachers in our sample tended to have more additional resources and opportunities to provide science education for their students. Okay? All right. So, moving on, to classroom influences on teacher attitudes towards science teaching. And we're first going to talk about what barriers keep teachers from teaching more science weekly. Okay? All right, so now I want you to go ahead and think to yourself for a moment, what do you think is a prevalent barrier that teachers report keep them from teaching more science weekly? So what do you think is something that teachers would often mention that keep them from teaching science weekly? Let's go ahead and think to yourself about that. And then once you got some ideas, go ahead and type them into the chat, but don't press enter. You guys are experts at this now. Hold back until I ask you to. All right, and press enter. Oh my gosh. Oh, lots of fast responses on this one. Materials, labs, certified teachers. Yes. Time, resources, professional development. Yes. Resources, time, priority. Yes. Time, lack of support and resources. Right. Time in the school day. Right. As some of you also saw, because as you remember when we were doing that little activity, you guys remembered. Very good. Funding, aids to help work with challenging students. Nice. Okay. All right. So let's see what those top 3 barriers were. So the top 3 barriers that teachers listed that kept them from teaching more science weekly was science not being scheduled into the class day, limited time for planning and preparation, and other subjects being a higher priority. Now, science not being scheduled into the class day was mentioned by 71% of all teachers, and 66% mentioned our second barrier, and 45% mentioned other subjects being a higher priority. Now, I want to just be clear, science not being scheduled into the class day means that there's no time allocated to teach science during the day, whereas like there's time, saved in the day for math. There's time saved in the day for reading and other subjects. And a lot of these teachers said that they just don't have time scheduled into the day for science. Okay? Now, go ahead and think to yourself for a moment and just think, you don't need to type it in the chat. How do you think the responses differed between Title I and non-Title I teachers? So do you think that maybe more Title I teachers said science not being scheduled into the class day, or do you think more non-Title I teachers mentioned that? What do you think that graph's going to look like after I show you? And then once you got some thoughts, go ahead and give me a thumbs up when you got your thoughts. Ooh, so many thumbs. Amazing. Awesome. All right, so let's check it out. All right, so before I reveal, let me actually orient you to this graph as well. So here we have the categories that were all talked about, right, that we just saw, the most mentioned barriers by all teachers. Science not being scheduled into the class day was up top because that was the most prevalent. Limited time for planning and preparation, second. And then other subjects being a high priority is third. Okay? All right, so let's check it out. Right, so there's actually not that much variation at all, right? The only category, which is the third category here, other subjects being a higher priority, was mentioned more by Title I teachers. Now, we think this is because, and we notice this in a lot of our responses, is that Title I teachers just mention more often that their schools seem to just have a higher focus on English language arts and mathematics. Now, we're going to take a look at what they said further in their written responses. But before we move on, I want to be clear that there were a lot more categories and common themes here, but I'm only showing you the top 3 because I want to make sure we have, more extra time to talk about the other results. Yeah? All right, let's see what they said. All right, so Fallon, a non-Title I teacher, says time in our daily schedule is limited. As previously mentioned, because of enrichment and focus on math and ELA, science just doesn't always fit in our schedule. Enrichment is like electives usually that students take, sometimes like art or other things. And Eve, a Title I teacher, says, there's a big push for ELA, English Language Arts, at my school, since many students perform below grade level, right? And that kind of speaks to what we were talking about, other subjects being a higher priority, right? So what can we infer based on our written responses and the distributions that we just said that we just saw in that graph? So we can claim that teachers experience similar barriers regardless of school type. And this is not too surprising because the barriers that teachers mentioned are things that many teachers just don't have control over, like science being scheduled into the school day. That's something that the district or administrators can control or can at least push for. Or they also mentioned general experience, right, that all teachers face. All teachers have limited time, right? Everyone has no time to plan and prepare for other things and other subjects, right? All right. So now that we're done with that, we're going to go to the positive things. So we're still in classroom influences, but we're going to talk about what positively influences how much teachers teach science weekly. Okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and think to ourselves, what do you think is a prevalent support that teachers mention that encourages them to teach more science weekly? So what do you think our teachers said that encourages them to teach more Science Weekly? I think I'll give you a minute to think about that. Now, once you got some ideas, go ahead and type them into the chat, but refrain from pressing enter. Ooh, we got a lone one. Student interest. It's okay, don't worry. Gotcha, Bree. Yeah. All right. And press enter. Resources, student interest, priority, funding, more time, supportive grade level team. Yes, Diane. Support from admin, supportive parents. Nice. School interest and allocating time for science. Same as Bree. Nice. Principal supporting and funding. Money. Nice. Paid planning time. Amazing. Support from parents. Okay, lots of different things, right? Amazing. All right, so these were the top 3 supports that teachers mentioned that encouraged them to teach more Science Weekly. And the first one was familiarity with an engaging curriculum. The second, student engagement during science activities. And the third, easy access to sufficient materials. Now, our first support was mentioned by 50% of all teachers, and our second was 47%, and our third, easy access to sufficient materials, was mentioned by 45% of teachers. Now, exactly like we just did for the barriers, go ahead and think to yourself for a moment, and no need to type it in the chat. How do you think those responses differed between Title I and non-Title I teachers? So do you think more Title I teachers said familiarity with an engaging curriculum, or do you think more non-Title I teachers said that first one? What do you think that graph's going to look like? And then once you got your thoughts, your ideas, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Yeah, ideas. Cool. Oh my gosh. So many people are ready. Great. Awesome. All right, so let's check out that graph. All right, so before I reveal what I found, let's orient you again to what is happening on this graph. Right, so like we saw before, familiarity with an engaging curriculum is the most mentioned support, and then student engagement during science activities was the second, so that's why it's second, and easy access to sufficient materials is the third, okay? All right, so this is what we found. So similar to barriers, there's actually not that much difference between Title I and non-Title I teacher supports. Now, the only one that is different is that second support, which is student engagement during science activities. And this was statistically significant. Now, the reason why we think this is so dramatically different is because as we saw in our PTA fundraising questions, non-Title I teachers in our sample may have just had more opportunities to observe and see how their students are participating in a science project because their PTA funds were able to pay for science teachers to either assist or do science activities in the classroom, right? Now, again, I want to mention that there were much more actually than 3 categories, but I decided to show you just the top 3 because these were the most prevalent, okay? Now, let's take a look at what they said in their written responses. All right, so Eldon, a Title I teacher, says, what's positive that helps me teach science are the resources in Amplify. Now, the slides are key. Without them, it would be very cumbersome to organize the lessons, right? And I also want to make sure everyone knows Amplify is the current elementary science curriculum that is being used for elementary school teachers, okay? Now, Rima, a non-Title I teacher, says students love science and often come engaged. The content directly relates to them and they're often excited to learn more. And so that speaks more to our student engagement during science activities kind of category, right? So what can we claim from this particular question here, from our results and our written responses? So this means that while teachers have a number of students in their classroom or experience different things daily, they ultimately feel supported by similar things, and regardless of their school type. Okay? So that's what we can kind of claim out of this. Now, moving on to our last and final research question here. So, our personal influences. So, how do teachers' gender identity and ethnicity influence their attitudes towards science teaching? Well, we're going to take another poll. So, do you think Title I and non-Title I teachers responded the same or different to the challenge statement below? Or maybe you don't know and you're not sure, and that's okay too. Now, the challenge statement is different, so my attitudes towards science teaching are strongly influenced by my gender identity and or ethnicity. Okay, and I'm going to launch the poll now. Launching. Let's go ahead and take your time to answer that. And remember, Title I means greater than or equal to 40% of low-income students, and non-Title I means less than 40% of low-income students. Okay? Excuse me. Okay, so we're almost there. Great. Oh, sorry. All right, living in the city is so good. All right, so looks like we got about 20 people. We're at 83% voted. I'm gonna wait maybe one more minute, give everyone about 30 more seconds to answer this poll here. All right, so I'm gonna end it now and share the results with you. Very interesting distribution here. So looks like 25% of you think it's gonna look the same, and 60% of you think it's gonna look different, and 15% of you said you don't know, which is okay. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing, and we're gonna go over it. All right. So this is the same format, so this is the same bar graph that we saw in that PTA closed-ended portion. So all teachers are on the far left, Title I teachers in the middle, and non-Title I teachers are going to be on the right. Okay? So let's remove to see the distribution of responses. So remember, blue bar means agree, and white bar means disagree, and gray bar represents don't know responses. Now, knowing that, we can see that there are a good amount of Title I teachers that responded agree to this statement, and more than non-Title I teachers, right? And so when we actually compared this closed-ended to, compared Title I teachers to non-Title I teacher responses, this was not statistically significant, but it does represent a trend. And this leads us to believe that if our sample size was larger, it might actually be something that we would consistently see. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at what teachers said in their written responses to this question. All right, so we got Imani, a non-Title I teacher, that said, as a woman of color, it is important for me to give opportunities to students who do not see themselves reflected in the field, not only to engage them and spark their passion, but to show them that they do belong, even though it will still be an uphill battle. And then we have Kirby, a Title I teacher, that said, my ethnicity also supports my attitudes towards science teaching in a positive and a critical way. As a brown Latino male, I see my role to inspire students from all backgrounds and levels of understanding. And then finally, we have Verity, a non-Title I teacher, that says, I am a Caucasian woman. I am not strongly underrepresented in the science field, but there are still many more males than females in the field. Initially, I also started teaching to assure that my daughters, who attend the school I teach at, would have a solid foundation and confidence in their scientific ability as they entered middle school. I had read Peggy Orenstein's book about girls dropping out of science in middle school, and I was determined to make sure that didn't happen to my daughters. Amazing. So really, really rich responses that we saw in our written responses. So just like the way that we quantified, those PTA written responses, we did the same thing for this particular challenge statement. So we read those responses, looked for common themes, and we created categories out of those themes. Okay? So these are the categories that we found among Title I and non-Title I teachers. So there were 4 categories that were created. So gender identity influencing teacher attitudes toward science teaching was the most prevalent. And second was ethnicity influencing teacher attitudes toward science teaching. And third were not influenced by their gender identity and their ethnicity. And then finally, there were a good amount of teachers that acknowledged how gender identity and or ethnicity may influence another teacher's attitude towards science teaching. So let's take a look at how these responses were distributed among Title I and non-Title I teachers. All right, so it's not too surprising because the bar graph we saw earlier kind of depicted this pretty well, right? We saw that more Title I teachers agreed that their gender identity and or ethnicity influences their attitudes. And we saw this obviously in our written responses too. But if we look at that first category here, the gender identity influencing attitudes, we see that it's pretty close, right? Non-Title I teachers mention gender identity pretty often as well. And when looking further into those written responses, we saw that teachers from both school types mentioned the importance of gender representation in science. And that's something that we could conclude from this particular question. Now finally, ethnicity being influenced by more Title I teachers was interesting, but we speculate that this might have been the case because if we remember from earlier, there were more teachers of color at Title I schools than non-Title I schools. Again, this is not the absolute reason why these responses were different, but just may have been a driving factor, right? Now, what was the most interesting about our ethnicity responses was that while reading and coding, we found that teachers of color from both school types mentioned how their ethnicity influenced their attitudes. And they also mentioned how they are aware of the diversity gap in science. And that's something that we could conclude from these written responses and this overall question too. Now, additionally, these teachers of color also mentioned that it is important for them to be a symbol for their students of color and to see someone who looks like them in a position of power. Now, according to previous literature, the reason why teachers of color are more likely to bring this diversity gap up and just more aware of this gap is because their experiences of discrimination in education overall. So now, kind of to wrap things up back again, what are our main findings that we notice in this entire project? PTA funds appear to drive science teaching inequities. We notice that Title I teachers seem to be more aware of the inequities that PTA funds can cause in science education. And we also notice that teachers share similar barriers and supports, regardless of their school type. And then finally, we notice that teachers of color seem to be more aware of the importance of representation of minorities in science too. So now, kind of bringing it back into thinking, where do we go from here? What do we do now? What are some future directions that we could take this assessment? First, if we were to actually repeat this study, we would investigate the ideas of elementary school teachers, all elementary school teachers, not only science teacher leaders, right? We would also repeat this study or conduct this research without the looming effects of the pandemic because, like we mentioned earlier, we believe that the pandemic was a main contributor to our lack of responses. Now, we would also like to conduct interviews and mixed focus groups with Title I and non-Title I teachers. And the reasoning behind this would be because interviews and focus groups are just more intimate. And it might encourage teachers to list and actually express more about their own personal experiences in science education. Now, ultimately, what we need to do is listen and center teacher voices, especially those that come from marginalized communities, because this will ensure that for others to create and provide a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive curricula for all students in science education. Okay? And that's it. So I just want to thank you so much for everyone who has supported me throughout this research and this project. I want to say thank you so much to Kimberly. Again, I would not have been able to do this without you, obviously. And I want to say thank you to my family and my friends, and obviously this the CEPL lab. We don't have any photos together with the CEPL lab, so I can find any. But thank you so much for constantly supporting me throughout this adventure. So thank you. Any questions?
Oh, and now we unmute again and we give a big round of applause and
Yay!
All right.
I'm gonna say that Maria Jose makes it all look kind of easy and straightforward, but it was an enormous amount of work to do this kind of research in the COVID era and to analyze all of those teacher responses. So Maria Jose, you make it look easy, and it was a really a huge amount of work. So we're gonna take questions, but in CEPL style, we always want to take just a moment to quietly think. If you're in a place where you could jot down your question, or if you're in a group, mute yourself and chat a little bit and talk about like what question you most want to ask Maria Jose. We'll take like a minute or so, give her a chance to catch her breath, and then we'll open it up for 10 minutes or so of questions. Okay. So it's just quiet thinking time. And you're also welcome to put your questions in the chat, but in a minute, I'll ask people to raise hands and we'll call on some folks. So just quiet thinking for about a minute. Or chatting if you go on mute. All right, Maria Jose, did you have a drink? Did you rest your voice for at least 30 seconds? That's a lot of talking.
Yeah.
So you are welcome to type a question in the chat. You're welcome to wave at me like this and with your body. You're also welcome, if you know how to work Zoom, you can do a reaction where you can raise your hand like this. All right, cool. And I see a question from Dr. Blake Riggs, but I'll wait until we have at least a few. Okay, I have a couple more over here. I said Dr. Blake Riggs. Who else is here? Oh, I have my hand up. I'm confusing myself. Who else has a hand up? It says 3. Help me out. You can just shout at me and take. Vivek. So I see Vivek and I see Blake, and then I think I'm the third one. All right. So Dr. Riggs, why don't you go first, and then we'll move to Vivek. Dr. Riggs.
Thank you. It's funny, every time I hear Dr. Riggs, I think people are trying to sell me something. So first of all, great presentation, as always. Just from knowing you for all these years, I expect no less, because you always bring the energy. I wanted to, a couple of things with the study here, and one's a question and one's more of a comment. I'll start with the question, is that in some ways there's kind of an implicit bias already built into your study, right? Because you're measuring Title I schools that have science leads. So if the school has a science lead, then that means they're prioritizing science. I just love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. That's
about like what you might find with other schools that don't have science leads. Do other schools have science? Is this a mandatory thing in the school district? Just talk more about the science lead role and where you see that.
Yeah, so science teacher leaders, one of the main things is that they're not required to have a science background in any way. And a lot of the time, they're just chosen by their principal. So it's not like they volunteer to be the science teacher leader because they love science. There are some that do, and they have their background in nutrition and stuff like that, and so they do stuff like that. However, I think that for the most part, the district requires that every school has science teacher leaders, and that's why if we were to ever repeat this study, I would love to do it with just everyone, because then that gives us a better understanding of how all elementary school teachers think about science. But the main reason why we decided to choose science teacher leaders is because we have connections in the district. And it was just an amazing opportunity to get a lot of data all at once. And because they're not necessarily required to have a degree, we took that as more, okay, so it's not necessarily implicit bias.
Nice. And then my comment just quickly, and I want to give everyone else space, but
Okay.
I really think you should be taking this presentation and presenting it to SFUSD, people who need to hear this. So
Oh yeah.
one of the problems that and my better half is is in
Yes.
the district, of course,
Yeah.
and we have these conversations over the dinner table. One of the issues is how we look at institutional data and getting at this idea. And she brought up this idea of street data, and she's reading this book now about talking about street data.
Yeah.
And your study really sticks out as, oh, this is street data. We're getting at like some of these qualitative things behind the numbers. So I just would really just make a push that even with the low numbers, I really could care less about the low numbers. I think they still need to hear this and hear this presentation, and that would spur it on to get higher numbers.
Absolutely.
And I'm muting myself now.
Okay. Thank you, Blake.
And for folks who don't know, Dr. Riggs, or Blake as we call him, is one of Maria Jose's thesis committee members.
Yes, I've known Blake for quite some time, so that's why it's so informal.
All right, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Any question. There's no question that is not incredibly welcome. All questions are most welcome. Vivek, I think you're up.
Thank you. I thought it was a really engaging presentation. I really appreciated the fact that you had poll questions to kind of keep us engaged with this, really get those gears turning. One of the things I thought of as you went through your presentation was, what is the educational background of the teachers you're polling? How does that impact their responses?
Sure.
Like location in which they got taught science, their relationship with science, going into becoming a teacher.
Yeah. So with the most part, elementary school teachers are required to go to college, and they have to have science courses. And so their experience in knowing science, kind of similar as to what I just mentioned to Blake, is that some of them major in science and actually have like degrees in science, but a lot of them don't. But they do have experience being in science classrooms. Now, I guess we noticed when we actually did, we collected a lot of our data with like teaching experience, and particularly in grades that they've taught. But we didn't really collect so much of like their university kind of experience. We did like collect that they attended professional development trainings. We did collect that they attended university and what kind of university, but we didn't go into so much detail as to about their background.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think one of the differences between doing a PhD and a master's is just the number of variables you can look at. And so it's a great question for a future study. Maria Jose, I'm going to read a couple of questions from the chat. I mean, you can see them too, but from Eleanor, because the school has a science teacher leader, where'd it go? Does that mean they have to teach science? Do you know if there are other requirements about if they teach science or how they do so? And I think you can share a little bit about maybe some of the questions you didn't show on that one.
Yes, of course. So Eleanor, that's a great question. So they don't necessarily have to teach science, but we did ask them, that first question that we asked them in our assessment was the statement, that challenge statement, I teach science every week. And that's where we could see whether or not teachers were engaged in regular science teaching. And we did see that they are engaged in regular science teaching. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to make sure that teachers, you know, had science on the brain, or they were thinking about science in a regular kind of way. But a science teacher leader doesn't really mean that they have to teach science. They could just be like in charge with going to these professional development trainings, and they learn all that information, and they're like, okay, guys, this is what I learned, and then they teach it to their other colleagues at that school, and or sometimes they're just getting supplies. Like, and I think Diane had mentioned that sometimes they're just getting supplies for science courses for the school as well.
Yeah, also a great question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Hector, I believe, says, great presentation. What implications does your study have regarding disparities of PTAs in Title I and non-Title I schools? And I know Maria Jose could talk about this for hours, so give that one a shot and not too.
I know. Okay, so I mean, I think for me, what my implications of this is that PTA is incredibly inequitable. And I think that it goes as far as all schools. It's not even just Title I and non-Title I schools, but we saw it specifically between these two different types of schools because there is obviously there's more students of low income in Title I schools. And to be honest, I really think that PTA should just be something that is pooled in like a center, and that all schools should be able to use that money that all parents fund. Because why are I mean, I could go on again. I just don't understand why a school needs $1 million to create a science laboratory and not share it with schools that barely have anything. So I think the implications are that PTA should be a pool of money that all schools should be allowed to have. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, I will say that I think I've told Maria Jose many times, no pressure, but if she wanted to go on and get a PhD, there has been no systematic study of PTA funding influence on core subjects, of which science is one, in San Francisco Unified, in the most liberal country in the country. Right. And Maria Jose's data points to here, we have some really deep inequities that are not being addressed, and she could absolutely extend that work. So
yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Pastor. Other questions, other hands?
Yeah.
All right. Well, what I'm gonna say at this point is that we're gonna give Maria Jose some more love, another round of applause. Please unmute, snaps or claps. Really wonderful piece of work.
Yay!
And two things are going to happen now. So one thing that's going to happen is that the thesis committee, and this is sort of an academic tradition. And remember, I'm first generation college going, and like every part of everything I've experienced at universities has been the strangest thing ever. So here's another strange one. We're just going to pop over to a breakout room, and we're just going to chat for a moment because Maria Jose's thesis committee members have had a chance to read her written document. So she wrote a giant paper on this, and we're going to check in about that. It won't take that long. And then we'll come back and do some congratulations. And while we're gone, you all should take turns in the chat or verbally, what have you, like talking to Maria Jose and congratulating her. And the one thing I want to say before I sort of depart is that I forgot in my introduction is that I'm incredibly proud because Maria Jose already has a post-graduation job, which is not a trivial thing to do. And I also neglected to say that she became part of the faculty at San Francisco State during the last semester of her graduate work. And so also give a big shout out because as a first generation college going person, being employed is really important part of extending your education. Woohoo! So Maria Jose is also officially now a professor of biology, which is phenomenal. It's just amazing and wonderful, and we're so proud of you. So I will stop talking now. I will say Blake Riggs and Diane Garfield, please look for an invitation, and we'll go to a breakout room. And Maria Jose, you can manage a crowd. You're in charge of managing the crowd.
Yeah.
What we can do is we can go walking.
No.
Almost, not quite, almost.
Almost.
All right, Blake, I'll see you there. And Diane, do you see that? Perfect.
Hi.
Yay!
That was amazing.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much all for being here. It's so good to see some of you that I haven't seen in so long. So it's so good. I'm glad I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I see, Lorena, you asked a question.
It was actually Uncle Nick's question.
Oh, do you think this research influencing non-Title I schools taking a more active role in distributing their funds to Title I? Well, I mean, I hope so. I hope that that could do that, like with PTA fundraising, essentially. I think that's what I mean. Like, I think that there should be a pool of money, or like a pot, I guess not a pool, a pot of money for everybody. Because it's just, to me, a bit unnatural for one school to have so much when there are so many that have so little. And so I think that
It's
that's
quite
something.
interesting that some of those questions, some of those responses were similar across the board with Title I and non-Title I
Oh,
schools.
yes,
That we
absolutely.
realize that it's a district move, right? Something that when it comes to like access to curriculum,
Hmm.
access to resources, PTA
Hmm.
funds, that
Hmm.
I think that it could be, we could pose the question of like, what is a district doing to really
Hmm.
support schools
Hmm.
across SF and in other communities as well, and not just leave it up to a single school to be able to fend for them.
Of course. No, absolutely. I mean, in general, I think the history of parent teacher associations is pretty long and pretty weird. So I think that the district should take a long, hard look at the fact that, like, while we live in the most like diverse city, and we live in a very like gentrified city now, the schools are now being affected as well. And so, and it's something that, I mean, that we have to like push for more community and more sense of like understanding that everyone deserves as like everything equitably, not just equally. That's my sister, everybody. Yeah. About taking this research across, Nicole, have you thought about taking this research across California and including both district and charter? Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes. I think that there, I mean, that would be a lot. That would be amazing. I think that that's more of a PhD. I don't have time for that, and I'm not looking for that. So I don't want to do that. So I think that that's something that um, I would love to pass on to someone else and give them this big fat document, just throw it on the table and just tell them, this is something that needs to be investigated a lot more than just me.
I really think it'd be beneficial for you to take
Absolutely.
it, or for somebody else to continue that research if you don't want to. I know you don't want to, but
I know. I
for
think
somebody else to, because in the like when I worked in charter schools, like I remember making those decisions, like, oh, are we going to get desks and reading materials, or are we going to get science curriculum? And it was desks and reading materials and not science curriculum.
right.
So I don't know. It'd be really interesting for somebody to like continue that, because I do think that this type of information should be shared
Oh, absolutely.
more widely.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it would be really interesting to probably see the differences among different states as well, and to kind of continue seeing how different districts in different like states prioritize science education versus other things, and if that's something that's seen across all United States instead of just California. But that would be like 10 years of work. That's crazy. So I'm good.
I have another question
Yeah.
with regards to the, sorry, there's a lot of sound here, but with regards to the teachers, what were their attitudes in general about the questions that you were asking? I mean, were they wondering what you would do with this information, or maybe some sort of follow up on whether this would, lead to more funds, more access, things like that?
Yeah, so that's
I imagine that elementary school teachers within Title I schools are probably pretty burned out in some situations, and would think, maybe not as positive about this research or where it could lead to. Did you ever get questions like that?
No, unfortunately, no, because this was all done online. And so I didn't have the opportunity to interact with a lot of teachers. Ideally, if it was done in person, we would have distributed this assessment at a professional development training, which is ironic nonetheless, and be like, hey, I'm here, do this assessment. And so from there, I think I would have gotten a lot more follow up questions on that. But I think the way that we approach this, and the way that similarly of how I ended this research, we wanted teachers to feel, and that they were being listened to and they were being heard, and give them that opportunity. Because a lot of times I think that the majority, while we all know that teachers do a lot, and especially K through 12 teachers do a lot of people don't understand how much they do, and they don't really ask how everything what they're doing. And so I think that this way, teachers were like, yes, I want to ask. I want to tell you what I've been through. And so in terms of that, but I would love to have had more interaction with them. That's a great question, Hector. So when we actually did when we reached out through that recruitment email, we made sure to tell teachers that we wanted to understand their attitudes towards science teaching within the classroom, before COVID-19. So we made that really clear. There were some responses that talked about Zoom and online learning, and some teachers, a very small pool of teachers, so I can't say that it was a large amount, but a really small pool of teachers mentioned how they did prioritize math and English because science, they just didn't know how to do science over the computer, and they didn't know what to use. And so it would be really interesting to do the effects between distance learning and how that might affect attitudes towards science teaching, and whether or not that even affects like classroom influences too. So, yeah. No, we would pair easily. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, Hector, you think that, right? And there's actually a lot of responses too that teachers mentioned that they did a lot more of like comparing teachers, and like the way that they used art and science. And so a lot of teachers did that, but not many enough to where it was representative in a category. And so unfortunately that wasn't a thing. I don't
Well,
have
they're still asking you questions.
I know, this is a hot topic. Yeah, and so
It's a hot topic.
yeah.
Well, I will say on behalf of Maria Jose's Thesis Committee, Diane, Blake, and myself, we are very excited to say congratulations on completing your graduate degree. And I have said all sorts of things that we were out there a long time because we were bragging on you, and then I realized, well, we should really say that in front of you and your friends and your family. And so, Diane, you have the floor for a couple minutes, and then Blake, and then I promise we'll get everybody here out of this Zoom room. Diane, where are you?
I just want to say congratulations, Maria Jose. You are amazing. And as I said a moment ago, I would love to see you come into elementary education and start teaching children and other teachers. But you have another trajectory, and maybe that PhD program will be your route. But you really have opened up an important discussion, and your findings are relevant. And I think it can really influence the future of science education in our schools. And as I said a moment ago, teachers do want to teach science. Teachers do see the value of it.
Yes.
They just don't have the time. So how can we fix that? How can we influence the bigger picture of the requirements that come down from the administration as to how many minutes a day are devoted to each other topic? And it can be integrated in. Science can be part of an English language arts curriculum as well as math. They all go together. And I think you have the keys, and I hope you will present to the school district, and we can get science into more classrooms. Thank you so much for this amazing work.
Thank you
so much, Diane.
Yeah.
Blake, you get the floor.
Thank you, and congratulations, great job. I've known you for a bit, and from our days on Bump, and it's just something with studies, right? We have an assumption that oh, scientist, educator, all these people have to be brilliant people, have to, do all this stuff. But in reality, it's people who bring the energy that change the world. And I just want to say that this is something that you have. And I wish I could bottle it and sell it because I'd be a millionaire. But just keep bringing that energy, because you bring that energy into whatever you do, you will be successful in. So great job here. I really feel that your thesis has the beginnings of really changing to make our education system a better place. But again, the sky's the limit for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Blake.
Thank
And
you.
the last thing I'm going to say, that I think the most important people in the room are family. And so I just want to give a huge shout out to Maria Jose's parents and siblings. I've heard so much about you. I'm only so sad I can't give you a big hug, but thank you so much. You should be so incredibly proud. And I've mostly held it together. Maria Jose, you get last word.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the support.
Thank you. So I just want to say, now I'm tearing up. Okay. So I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's been such a hell of a ride. So I'm so happy to have shared all this information with all of you. And I really look forward to, continuing to talk about these issues because they are so important. And to hanging out in person again. I really look forward to that.
So Maria Jose, I think you should turn the music on, and then everyone, thank you for coming. Have a great day. If you have any last things to say to Maria Jose, we will keep the link open, but otherwise have a great day and weekend, and thanks for all of your support. Turn on the tunes. Congratulations!
Yay! Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Great job. Get some rest.
Bye.
Congrats. See you later.
Bye. Later. Bye. Bye.
Oh, there's a party. Ethan's got the party rolling.
I know. You can
Nicely done.
Yeah.
All right.
Lisa and Tay.
Comments.
Yeah, I think they're out of here.
All right. I am going to stop the recording if I can figure out how to do that. Stopping the recording.
Yeah.
Boom. And then